The sky was heavy, almost suffocatingly silent. Dark gray clouds moved over the hills like a silent army. Somewhere in the distance, thunder echoed, as if even nature had held its breath. Samson stood motionless in the middle of the corral, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was not just a horse. He was once a legend, but now, with his white coat covered in scars and his broken spirit, only silence remained. No one dared to get too close to him. There was the sound of an engine in the distance, a shabby pickup truck slicing through the air, slowly climbing up the dirt road. Behind the wheel was James Harper, 37 years old, with short, light brown hair, his face tired and hardened, his hands clasped tightly around the steering wheel. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his mind was lost in the past. He had not set foot on this farm for years. He hadn't had the courage to return after losing the army, his unit, and everything that was left of his own identity. But now, there was only one thing that had brought him here: Samson. The rain began to fall in thick drops as James stepped out of the truck, darkening the brim of his hat and revealing a few strands of gray hair. He approached the choir with heavy steps, each step carrying the weight of the past. There he stood, Samson, the horse that had once saved his life. But now, in Samson's gaze, there was the emptiness that pierced James like a dagger. Samson did not turn his back on James, but took a few steps back. James crouched on the edge of the fence, his fingers tightly entwined in the wire mesh. "Samson," he whispered, his voice hoarser than the rain. His eyes began to burn, his throat tightened. She waited for a sign, the slightest movement, a recognition, a spark of hope. But Samson just walked away. A step, an eternity. James felt empty inside. In the distance, a young farm worker named Jenny was watching them. She approached hesitantly, her voice so light it was almost lost in the rain. "She doesn't trust anyone," she said, "especially men. Something's happened to her." James turned his head, his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry, because he already knew the truth. Why Samson was like this? Because he carried the same wound. The rain grew faster, as if the sky wanted to share the pain. James turned his eyes back to Samson and murmured to himself, "This time I won't let you down." The rain fell relentlessly throughout the night, turning the soil to mud and burying the farm in a heavy layer of fog. James barely slept during the night in a small worker's cottage, his eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling, listening to the echoes of the past. As dawn broke, he walked towards the choir, accompanied by a cold wind. Samson was still standing in the same corner, his eyes far away, his body showing no sign of relaxation, always alert. James approached, leaned against the fence, and whispered, "I am like you, still there in the past." He exhaled a short breath that was not like a laugh, a bitter reminiscence. "We never left that place, did we, Samson?" Jenny watched them from a distance, pretending to carry a bale of hay. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached. "You seem to have a special bond with an animal you know so well," he said, his voice tinged with curiosity. James didn't answer. He kept his eyes on Samson. "He saved my life," he finally said, the words coming out of his mouth like a burden. He made it clear he didn't want to say any more, and Jenny quietly walked away. James opened the fence gate and entered the grove with slow steps. Samson's ears pricked up, his eyes locked on James, but he did not back away. James knelt, hands at his sides, making no threatening movement. He pulled a small piece of leather from his pocket, a piece of equipment Samson wore around his neck in times of war. When Samson saw the leather, there was a momentary spark in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished and replaced by emptiness. James took a deep breath. "You remember. But it hurts to remember, doesn't it?" The midday sun was beating down on the fence, but the heat meant nothing to James or Samson. They were both in a silent battle between unseen walls. James took a few steps back, desperate patience in his eyes. He was looking for a glimmer of hope in Samson's blank stare. Jenny watched from afar, silently. The silence between them communicated more deeply than words. "This is not going to be easy," Jenny said quietly. "His wounds are too deep." James nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on Samson. "No one is beyond repair," he said in a determined voice. He took another step, but this time not forcing it, just making his presence felt. And at that moment, Samson turned his head slightly. It was a very small movement, but it pierced James' heart like a spear. For the first time, Samson had sent a signal in James' direction. It was a beginning, and James vowed not to lose that little sign. The farm was silent in the afternoon, only the sound of the wind rustling the dry grass. James stood in front of a small hut, lost in thought. In his hand, he held an old piece of Samson's saddle from the war, the leather worn, The edges cracked, but the memory as vivid as the first day. This time he would try to reach him in a different way, not with words, but with memories. He felt his heart race as he opened the fence gate. Samson stared at James, his ears perked forward, but his body was still tense, like a spring ready to spring at any moment. James took a deep breath, dropped the piece of saddle, and took a few steps back. Samson stretched out his nose and sniffed the air like he was sniffing memories. One step, then another. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the saddle piece on the ground. James watched with a strange feeling in his heart, a mixture of hope and fear. At that very moment, Samson lowered his head slightly and rubbed his nose on the saddle piece. It was a small, almost invisible movement, but for James it was the sign he had been waiting weeks for, a memory, a connection, still living somewhere deep inside him. His eyes welled up, but he managed to hold back the tears. He did not move quickly, just knelt down to Samson's level. "Here I am," she said in a soft voice, "and I'm not going anywhere." Samson raised his eyes to James, and for a long moment they were still, staring at each other in silence, burdened by the past. Then Samson took a slow step towards James. Not a run, not a lightning leap, just a silent, heavy step. But in James' world, that step was like a miracle. He held out his hand slightly, fingers outstretched, and waited patiently. Samson tilted his head slightly forward, sniffed James' hand, and for a brief moment touched his nose to his fingers. They both stayed where they were for a while, motionless, almost holding their breath. And then James whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Samson." As the sky slowly cleared, a hopeful silence filled the farm. And for the first time in a long time, James could actually breathe. At that very moment, Samson lowered his head slightly and rubbed his nose on the saddle piece. It was a small, almost invisible movement, but for James it was the sign he had been waiting weeks for, a memory, a connection, still living somewhere deep inside him. His eyes welled up, but he managed to hold back the tears. He did not move quickly, just knelt down to Samson's level. "Here I am," she said in a soft voice, "and I'm not going anywhere." Samson raised his eyes to James, and for a long moment they were still, staring at each other in silence, burdened by the past. Then Samson took a slow step towards James. Not a run, not a lightning leap, just a silent, heavy step. But in James' world, that step was like a miracle. He held out his hand slightly, fingers outstretched, and waited patiently. Samson tilted his head slightly forward, sniffed James' hand, and for a brief moment touched his nose to his fingers. They both stayed where they were for a while, motionless, almost holding their breath. And then James whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Samson." As the sky slowly cleared, a hopeful silence filled the farm. And for the first time in a long time, James could actually breathe. "Do you remember? That sound was a signal for you to come back. Just like now." Samson took a few steps, stopped. He was very cautious, but this time he was approaching instead of running away. James didn't move, gave him space. He just waited, holding his breath. Samson came slowly to James, bowed his head, and sniffed the bell. He whispered softly as James' heart pounded in his chest, "Here you are, just as I expected you to be." They stood like that for a while, the wind gently shaking the bell and memories of the past dancing in the breeze. James reached out his hand but did not touch Samson. He let him decide. And at that moment, Samson rested his head lightly against James' leg. James closed his eyes, silently taking a deep breath. This was not just a contact. It was a silent vow that showed that despite all the burdens of the past, there was still a bond. James whispered in a low voice as the sky began to darken, "We'll get better together, I promise." And that was the first step in a new beginning for both James and Samson. The next morning, the sunlight brought a soft warmth to the farm. James sat on the porch steps, clutching his coffee cup in both hands. His eyes scanned the open fields beyond, but his main attention was on Samson. The white horse roamed freely in the morning coolness, but there was a change in his movements. His stride was more supple, his gaze more alive. James felt a small spark of hope. He had prepared something special for the day. From inside the house, he pulled out an old military blanket and a buckle with Samson's name engraved on it. This buckle had been worn on Samson's saddle in times of war, a souvenir he carried on every mission as a lucky charm. James approached the corral with slow steps, the blanket draped over his arm. Samson noticed him but did not run, just watched. James spread the blanket on the ground, placed the buckle in the center, and took a few steps back. He expected Samson to make the first move. The horse lowered its head, sniffed the air, stepped forward slightly. James held his breath. Samson approached the blanket, sniffed the buckle, and looked up at James. There was a familiar glint in his eyes. James whispered, "That's it, you remember, don't you?" Samson took another step right in front of James. Neither of them moved. Time seemed to stand still. And And then Samson rested his head lightly on James's chest. For the first time that day, tears welled up in James's eyes. He put his hands carefully around Samson's neck, not squeezing him, just feeling his presence. It was not just a contact, but a silent return of everything they thought was lost. As the sky turned blue, James whispered quietly, "We are not going anywhere. We are here, together." The weather was clear that morning. Sunlight streamed through the roof of the barn, leaving golden trails in the wet earth on the ground. James stood by the fence, fingering the small metal bell in his pocket. His thoughts were still at war with the past. He muttered quietly to himself, "One more step today." He slowly shook the bell in his hand. Tinkle, tinkle, that old familiar metallic sound filled the air. Samson looked up as soon as he heard the bell. His ears suddenly perked up, his pupils dilated, his body tensed. James immediately noticed the change in his gaze. "Hey, calm down," James said, approaching slowly, but it was too late. Suddenly the roar of a military helicopter passing in the distance tore through the sky. The sound, combined with the bell, triggered old scenes in Samson's mind. He ran, skidding left and right. Mud splattered, his breathing quickened. James raised his hand, but he didn't shout. "It's okay, son. It's safe here. This is no longer a battlefield." Samson stopped for a moment, his eyes still full of panic. But James' voice was like an echo from the past. He slowed down, he stopped, and then, panting, he turned to James, and then there was silence. James came closer. He showed me his hands. "I'm here. I'm with you. I haven't gone anywhere." And for the first time, Samson approached, not with fear, but with confidence. After the storm, the ground had softened, and the mud made every step heavy. But James didn't mind the mud. That morning he appeared in the paddock with an old mop and a clean bucket of water. He was determined. It was time to take care of Samson, not just mentally but physically. Samson was just beyond the fence, still cautious but no longer a horse running away, but a friend trying to figure out what had happened. James bent down quietly. He put the bucket down. He felt the dirt floor with his hands. "My turn," he said in a low voice. Samson moved forward slightly. Each step got stuck in the mud, but he kept going. James was surprised, but he didn't show it. "That's it," he said. "That's a step." The man bent down, carefully checking Samson's back leg. His finger stopped on a bump. The animal moaned slightly. James immediately stepped back. Okay, we won't force this." But Samson didn't run away. He stayed. He was there. James took a deep breath. It was the first time they had been so close. "You're not alone anymore," he said, "and neither am I." James worked in silence. Slowly he wiped the mud away with the cloth. Samson's fur was getting wet, but this time there was no escape. The wind was following them. A bond was sprouting under the mud. And that day, a step was taken in the mud. It was not a great victory, but sometimes the most powerful steps are the quiet and dirty ones. The afternoon sun cast a warm orange glow over the old paddock. James took the small, rusty bell out of his pocket. He held it in his fingertips, a silent witness to years gone by. Samson stood a few feet away. He tilted his head slightly to the side, watching intently. There was no longer fear in his eyes, but curiosity. James knelt on the ground. He didn't mind the mud. He held the bell in his palm, took a deep breath, and shook it gently. The sound of the bell, light, trembling but alive, filled the air. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. Samson was startled by the sound. He took a step back. Then he stopped. His ears pricked up. James put the bell down. The bell shook slightly in the mud, but the sound did not disappear. They both remained silent. "This is not the sound of war," James said quietly. "It is the sound of salvation." Samson lowered his head, sniffed the earth, took a few steps towards the bell. With each step, the mud bounced slightly, and finally, he touched his nose to the bell. James closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. This small touch was the first time the trust they had lost in the past breathed again. The earth, the mud, and the bell, they had all become symbols. Silence was no longer just a void, but a forgiveness, and both of them, human and animal, began to be reborn in this mud. The next morning there was a soft layer of fog over the ranch. The ground was wet, but the air was peaceful. James walked quietly to the old training ground. In his hand he carried the rusty training bell he had used years ago. Once on the battlefield, ringing this bell was a command for Samson. Now, a reminder. "Ready?" James said to himself. And then 2 short chimes echoed. Zink, zink. Samson stopped at the stable door. He turned his head, his eyes fixed on one spot. His ears twitched. James took a step back. He waited. And in that moment, Samson didn't run. He didn't panic, but he walked straight towards him. There was a familiar rhythm to his steps. James's heart quickened. His eyes welled up. "That's it," he said in a whisper. "You're still there." Samson stopped right in front of James. He bowed his head. He touched him lightly on the shoulder. James's hands trembled. He held out his hand. This time not to touch, but to wait. and Samson rested his head in his hand. Not one of them spoke. They didn't need to speak anymore. It was not a word, but a memory, a vow, a reconstruction of the past. The day passed slowly, but those few seconds were the moment when time stopped. Remembering all was the first key to healing, and in that moment the two warriors found each other again. The afternoon sky had turned golden and purple. A gentle breeze caressed the grass, and the old paddock was filled with peace. James opened the stable door and Samson walked out freely. But this time, there were no chains, no orders, just freedom. Samson stopped for a moment. He lifted his nose in the air, then he turned his head toward James, and James started walking, not side by side, not in front, not behind. Slowly, even steps, and Samson walked with him. The steps didn't crush the grass. It was as if the earth itself was carrying them. James didn't speak. Samson made no sound, but they both knew this was not goodbye. This was a new beginning. As they walked together into the sunset, James whispered, "You never left me, did you?" And Samson paused for a moment to rest his head on James's shoulder. A touch, a thank you, a vow. As the sun sank below the horizon, two weary souls walked together. The war was over, but the friendship lasted forever. Does this story remind you of a friendship hidden deep in your heart? If this quiet devotion touched your heart too, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Do you dare to make peace with the past one day? We look forward to your answer in the comments.